Hello and welcome to the Business of Property podcast. I'm Stuart.
And I'm Simon.
We're both property people running our own property businesses, and this podcast is just us chatting, as we often do, about anything and everything property. And at the time of this recording, the budget has just been released. So we thought it would be a little bit silly if we didn't start talking about that and just getting a high level view of how that affects us as property people and more specifically our property businesses. Now, I can be completely honest and say that the time I've had, I've only seen a few headlines in newsagents because I have been very limited on time. But of course, I always defer to Simon on these kinds of things, given his depth of research and analytical capabilities. So, Simon, I guess the first question that all of us have at these times of budget is, what's happening to us as landlords? Because we've been hammered for a long time now. Is there anything you've seen that we should be wary of that's come out in this budget?
Well, first of all, I'm just going to sort of frame my answers in appropriate light of having read a few articles and write-ups, one of which was from an accountant, and not having done any deep analysis, as you may have suggested in that intro.
Okay, caveats applied.
Given that, this budget seems, from a landlord point of view, to have largely left us alone, which I think is good, and possibly as good as we could have expected as landlords and property people. Now, I should say property people as a whole obviously includes developers, and the story's a little bit different for them. But yeah, for landlords, I think it's quiet, and nothing's got better, but hopefully nothing has got worse either. So yeah, all good.
I think we should be happy with that, given the events over the last few years, such as the removal of interest rate relief and so on. I think I'm happy with the status quo for now, so that's always a good start.
Yeah, there were certainly a lot of rumours flying around, as there always are before budgets, that things were going to get terrible and capital gains tax was going to be hiked and goodness knows what else. And yeah, it's all good. And in fact, actually, I believe that the time you have to pay your capital gains tax has actually increased. So it was 30 days after you've sold a property, and I believe it's changed in the budget to 60 days. So maybe there is actually a little tiny good bit even in there.
We've got to take what we can get, haven't we, at the moment? And the other element that certainly caught my eye briefly was around cladding, given the issues which I've documented fairly well on this podcast, having bought a flat a couple of years ago where we've got an issue with cladding. So what did you see around that, Simon?
So I think this is probably all too late for your flat, which is a shame. But yeah, the government announced £5 billion of money to help with the cladding problems and help resolve those. Although a lot of that's going to be raised from the larger house builders. And they've announced a levy of, I think, 4% on house builders that make over £25 million in profit. So I doubt those particular businesses are very happy. But then again, they are making £25 million in profit. So I'm not going to feel too sorry for them.
No, let's not.
On house builders, though, one other thing that perhaps wasn't in the budget was an extension to Help to Buy. And that's now set to, I believe, end in 18 months' time, roughly, which is how it was before and how it still is because it wasn't changed in the budget. And I think house builders were actually hoping that would be extended again. And I saw a comment from Bellway, one of the big house builders, saying that the lack of Help to Buy is actually going to affect their plans and reduce some properties or reduce the number of properties that they're planning to build. So it's interesting, I think, that the house builders are so reliant on a government scheme, Help to Buy, to help boost their revenues and presumably profits from certain developments, that without it, they might actually change their minds on building some of them. Mm. So I find that a bit surprising and obviously a bit disappointing that there might be fewer houses being built, because I really think we need more, not less.
Well, and the government agrees, don't they? The target was, from memory, circa 280, 300,000, I think, per annum. And, we were well behind that already. So that's not in debate. And I suppose from a Help to Buy perspective, who are the people that are most buying new builds? I've just bought one. I guess families and people moving up, but first time buyers probably a great market and for Help to Buy, obviously. So it'd be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, definitely. I think something that maybe will help try to counter that was in the budget as well was some extra money to unlock brownfield sites. So I've not included the actual amount in our notes, so I don't know the numbers to quote you, but it's millions of pounds that the government have said they're going to put into helping develop brownfield sites. Now, considering most of the development of brownfield sites will actually obviously be done by builders, I'm not entirely sure how this money is intended to be spent, whether it's backhanders to the builders or whether it's sort of in the planning and within councils to help them progress such sites or identify sites and things like that. But I think it's a good move. I mean, what's your view, Stuart, on trying to build more within towns and make the most of that space, or do you prefer the sort of more rural, spread out approach to housing?
I think where we are as a society is that we should be making the most of what we've already got. And if that means using existing buildings, land sites, then for me that makes perfect sense. And I'm not thinking from a purchaser point of view or an investor point of view. I'm just thinking from an environmental point of view. If we've got brownfield sites, and we've all seen it, particularly given the last couple of years where we know the retail landscape has changed dramatically, something I'm sort of aware of in my consultancy role, then we need to be using those spaces. You spoke with our guests, Pam and Tanya, recently about John Lewis, who are turning residential, and I read about that a while back as well. But it makes perfect sense to me that we should be using all of the available space we've got. Obviously anyone that's been in property investment, we had the big splurge on office to residential. We've seen the conversion of pubs, and there's no reason that shouldn't then be retail to residential. If those spaces aren't getting used, then why shouldn't we? And then I think then look at other spaces. But that's kind of my view. I suppose I've got a fairly strong view on that, as you might have detected there. But that is my view on that.
There are lots of plots of land around the place that are not being utilised either at all, or where property has been sort of abandoned, or it's only used a little bit now, and there's lots of extra space around it and things. And I do feel that's really a waste. However, I'm going to talk just quickly about a couple of real life examples close to us. So there in Red Hill, I'm currently aware of at least 3 office blocks that are being converted into residential flats. And I think there might be a 4th, but I'm not sure if that's actually already happened and been finished. So we're losing 3 fairly big office buildings, maybe 4, and they're going to become flats. Red Hill is also undergoing some big development with 3 big flat developments. One of them replacing a previous building, an old cinema that was knocked down, and another one on I say empty site, but actually it did have a sort of a shed type construction on it, which was replaced. And then another one which was replaced, effectively a car park and some other bits and pieces in the town centre. So these are all sort of inner town developments. And yet that means that we're ending up with some quite tall new buildings in a town centre that isn't that tall. I mean, there's a couple of tallish buildings, but these new ones are going to be the tallest buildings in the Red Hill town centre. And we are ending up with literally hundreds of new flats coming onto the market. Now, from my personal point of view, I don't invest in flats. Well, I'm not going to do this now. I don't invest in flats, at least at the moment. And I think, Stuart, you've said you don't either at the moment. So do we want all these extra flats coming into our Red Hill town centre?
Are you talking as an investor or just a member of the local community?
Oh, take your pick. It's fine.
So I think, we've talked about it at the start. I think everyone's going to have different views on what it should be. But I think it's very hard to argue if space is wasted and we need housing to not bringing housing. I think, and again, I wouldn't defend any planning because I don't know enough detail, but I would say in these areas, and I've seen it in a few towns actually, I suppose the only thing I would say is that when people move into the centre of town, so if they're moving to whatever the centre of town is, but in the centre of Redhill, for example, you're within walking distance of the train station, with all of the transport infrastructure. So I wouldn't, because that is the worry. When I see big flats going up, and we have had a huge block go up where an old nightclub used to be, and every time I drive past it, it's next to a roundabout, which gets clogged at the best of times. And I think, add another 250 flats to it, what's this going to be like if even 20% of these have cars? So that's the other thing. But again, conversations we've had on this podcast about the transition of society to electric and how the world is moving. So I guess in summary, I don't feel that strongly. I think we need housing. First-time buyers need housing. The more housing there is, the better it is for those that need housing. And I'm thinking particularly of first-time buyers. We're the next generations are coming through, our next generations and their kids, and we want them to be able to experience life as we have, and for it not to be a distant memory to own property. So that's always my concern.
Yeah, I think your concern around traffic is one that certainly rings true for me as well in Redhill. It is going to have an effect. There's going to be a lot of extra foot traffic around, and also vehicle traffic. It's going to be a lot busier in Redhill town centre with all these extra people moving in. A lot of the flats as well don't have parking spaces either, so I don't quite know where people are going to park their cars, or whether there really is that many people who don't own cars. So it'd be interesting. Well, there is of course a on-demand car usage scheme with a couple of sites in Redhill as well, so maybe they'll grow nicely.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I was going. The future landscape is changing so quickly. It's changing so quickly how it is, and the specifics that we're talking about, and I'm sure in central locations, the rationale is that the flats that we're talking about, they are literally across the road and you're at the station, so you're right there. So the likelihood is you don't need. It's a bit like living. It's kind of great. It's just out of it's Surrey, but it's a stone's throw from Croydon, which is Greater London, and you've then got trams, tubes, and everything else. So it's like if you live in central London, most people won't buy a car for all the reasons you've mentioned. Finding a car park space would be fun, and all of that. So for me, there's always an element of NIMBYism, because you're like, well, I don't really want it here, but we need the housing, so it's got to go somewhere. But I think it's an interesting conversation as well about the future of transport and working, because we are just having the chat as we do on this podcast. And I had to go for a meeting yesterday, and drove to the meeting to where I used to consult, and it just took me back to having to drive to and from an office. Commuting, which I haven't done for a long time. And I thought, there are so many elements of commuting that I miss. Having time, and for me, I was driving, but if you get in the train, you can read and so on. And of course, all the things of working with other people, which I think I miss. But my view was I could do it, but I certainly wouldn't want to do it more than 2 days a week. And I would imagine there is a strong view coming through, and we're seeing that with some big organisations now, where they're saying people don't have to come back full time. So I think we're going to see a real change to working habits. So for example, those flats near a train station, whatever train station that is in the UK, I can see people wanting that, because for the 2 or 3 times they might commute to central London, for example, it's great. But then also they're still local, and they've got a good living environment. So it's interesting to see how this is going to play out with all of the environmental challenges we've got around, cars as well.
I think you're very, very much right that the new normal is a change in working patterns. And I've seen this echoed through numerous articles and other podcasts and discussions I've been involved in, that people are not going to be working full-time from offices again, ever. There are some exceptions. Some job roles require movement to be on site. But generally speaking, office work is going to be a mix of remote working, whether that's at home or in a local hub, and commuting into an actual official office for that job. And as you say, it's going to be sort of in the 2 to 3 days a week split. And that's obviously going to change the way people commute. I think that might actually reduce the sort of importance of train station being across the road, because now you're perhaps only commuting into London once a week. So on that one occasion a week, you could travel a bit further to the train station, perhaps even drive to the train station, because there are fewer people doing it. The car park at the train station is a bit emptier, so it's easier to park in and things like that. That means that actually you might want a car more because you're living further away from the train station. Or even if you are choosing a town centre flat, so you've got the convenience of the shops and whatever else around, or entertainments as well, around a town centre, it might then mean that you're only using the train once a week and you actually want a car more for other things because they're where you travel more often. So to go and see friends or family who aren't on a commuting route. And that may well actually, I think, mean that cars are more important as a sort of percentage of people's travel time. Of course, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to own your own car. It might mean that you make more use of car clubs or taxis or what have you. But yeah, I think the importance of the travel hubs around sort of train stations and the like may well be reduced in this new world.
Well, I think they will be reduced, and we've already seen that. But I think the argument is somewhat circular, because what we're saying is if you don't need a train station so much, you don't need to live near a train station. However, if that's where the properties are, where they've just built 250 properties, that's where you're going to go. So I think it's where it is. And I think the other thing that you've talked about, so first of all, commuting isn't the only reason. And I think about the next generations coming through. I've always, and again, this is just from where people come from, isn't it? I completely agree. We are less geographically dependent than we've ever been. And I think that's a great thing because there's a much more mobility. But I don't think that changes where you need to live. The car argument is one thing, but if one thing we've seen happen with the I don't want to get into the millennials, Gen Zs, and so on and so forth, but the subscription model, I can see that playing out even more so in terms of the transport. We're talking about cars. We might not have cars in 20 years, and I say that slightly tongue in cheek, but there are plans for taxis that fly, and we do know that driverless cars is a thing. So it might not be whether train stations are as important, but I can't see, certainly in the next 20 years, why it would be a negative to have a property next to a key hub, because people would like to say travel to central London or central Leeds or central Liverpool, because particularly the younger generations, that's where it's happening. As always, I tend to see both sides of it, and I think both things can perfectly be true and still be good for the community, first and foremost and most importantly, but also for us as investors and landlords.
In the long term, I agree. In the short term, while people are still quite car ownership obsessed, I think some of these town centre flats that don't come with parking and there is no parking around, I think they may struggle a little bit. But we'll see. I mean, the developments in Red Hill, as an example, seem to be selling quite well. So I think perhaps my theory is completely groundless. I don't know. But on one other matter, I've been excited and thrilled by the idea of flying cars being just around the corner since I was a teenager. And that was longer ago than I want to work out. So I'm not convinced that we're going to arrive at flying taxis anytime soon.
Well, they've been testing it. I haven't heard, they've been testing it.
They've been testing it since I was a teenager.
Well, but we've seen some really, I think you've got key players now, and it could all be PR, but I think there will come a time. And again, we only have to drive down any of our key routes at rush hour times to know that people aren't going anywhere fast. And in certain countries, maybe America or Australia, that's not going to be an issue. But in this country, we're certainly going to have to start looking at alternatives. And I'm not saying, we're all going to be like the Jetsons in our little bubble helicopters. But I just see the way where we're at now with technology, electric, because they're testing electric propulsion. I know we're massively digressing on our podcast, but I guess I just don't write it off. I think in terms of the progression that we're seeing, but you're right, there's always going to be a legacy for those of us that have grown up with cars. But then I think my grandmother, when she was born, there was no such thing as cars. And in her 90-odd year lifetime, and she died a few years ago now, but in her lifetime, there wasn't such a thing as cars, then there was. So I just don't write off. And then with the speed of change that we're seeing at the moment, I don't write these things off, because I think, especially with the acknowledgement, the wider acknowledgement that, around climate change, whatever we agree or disagree about that from a political standpoint, but we've all agreed that then there is going to need to be a big change about how we operate. That's another podcast. I think it's not an us podcast, but it's an interesting one.
No, indeed. And speaking of another podcast, we should probably wrap this one up. But yeah, I'm very much looking forward to individual Jetson style point-to-point drone automated transportation system.
I'm going to research it now, because I'm sure someone quite significant was investing into one of these companies. And I think usually where people put their money, significant investors, there tends to be some movement. So I'm going to research it just for you, because I want to give you your dream.
Excellent, thank you. I will look forward to hearing back.
I hope that the listeners have enjoyed today's discussion. It's high level chat, and as always, we try and bring you value. And if we have brought you any sort of value, please do leave us a rating or review, or even just reach out to us to say that you've listened. That would be nice. For everything else, please go to thebusinessofproperty.com. Other than that, we'll see you next week.